Around the world, a girl under the age of 15 gets married every 7 seconds. The highest rates of child marriage are found in Africa, but you might not know that child marriage is legal and tolerated in 49 American states. Not only that, but parents in the US can force their underage, pregnant daughter to get married, even if she's been raped. So what's the deal with child marriage in the US? This is So What, our look at stories from around the world. Some have been big news, others you might have missed, but all deserve your attention. So like and subscribe and leave a comment if you have suggestions for a story you want to learn more about. Today, we're talking about child marriage in America. It's taken until 2018 for the first US state to ban child marriage. In Delaware, it's now illegal for anyone under the age of 18 to get married, even with their parents' permission. The bill was supported by Democrats and Republicans and was passed unanimously in state Senate. Now, it might sound obvious to prevent children from getting married, but Delaware is the exception to the rule. Across America, campaigners are still fighting to close legal loopholes that, well, in effect, allow parents to force their children into marriage. So how big a problem is child marriage in the US? Here's Frady Reese. She's the founder of Unchained at Last, a charity fighting child marriage in the US.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are very surprised to learn how pervasive a problem child marriage is in America. We at Unchained at Last retrieved marriage license data from across the US and discovered that in just the decade 2000 to 2010, an estimated 248,000 children were married in the US as young as 12 years old, possibly even younger, and almost all of them were girls married to adult men.
Across the US, you normally need your parents' permission to get married before your 18th birthday. But in every state except Delaware, there are loopholes that allow much younger children to get married. Now, of course, some of these will be young couples in love, but there are some cases where the law fails to protect vulnerable children. So how does this affect girls' lives? Well, let's talk about one of the most high-profile and disturbing cases of child marriage in the US. It's the story of Sherry Johnson, a 58-year-old woman from Florida. But when Sherry was just 8 years old, she was raped repeatedly by 2 church leaders. By the time she was 10, she was pregnant.
I was 11 when I was forced to marry my rapist. My mom said, well, you're gonna marry him. And I'm like, marry him? I don't know what marriage is.
The men who abused her would have faced charges of statutory rape. But the marriage, well, that meant that in law, her new husband was immune from prosecution. It was only in March 2018, nearly 4 decades after the marriage, that the law in Florida changed following a campaign led by Sherry Johnson and others. The state brought in a new minimum age for marriage, 17 years old. So what about the rest of America? It's not just Florida where the so-called, and it's an awful phrase, marry your rapist loopholes exist. In Missouri, you have to be at least 17 to consent to sex. But between 1999 and 2015, more than 1,000 15-year-olds got married in Missouri. And around 300 of those girls married men who were older than 21. It's thought that some of the grooms were in their 40s and 50s. Now, under normal circumstances, a man of that age having sex with a 15-year-old would be considered a rapist. But those 300 men, well, they married girls who would otherwise be considered their victims. And the marry your rapist loopholes, that means that they're immune from prosecution.
Unfortunately, this is just shocking. In many states, marriage is an exception under statutory rape laws. And so what happens is in those states, every time a marriage license is handed out to an adult to marry a child under the age of consent to have sex or not allowed to consent to sex with somebody that spouse's age, that's in essence a get out of jail free card. We're legalizing rape.
So why isn't there a national ban on child marriage in the US? One reason is that it's individual states that set laws around marriage rather than the federal government. That means that campaigns have to be fought in all 50 state capitals and not just back in Washington, D.C. Okay, so that's 50 battles rather than just one. But the arguments are easy to win, right? Wrong. In 2017, New Jersey lawmakers passed a bill to ban child marriage without exception. But the state's Republican governor, Chris Christie, well, he refused to sign it into law. He said that the ban would conflict with religious customs. Christie didn't say what exactly he meant by this, but it's not the first time we've heard a religious defense of child marriage. Groups like New Jersey Right to Life say girls who fall pregnant at 16 or 17, they should be allowed to marry the father of their child. Other religious groups argue that some forms of child marriage can reduce the number of babies born out of wedlock.
Well, I haven't heard any logical reason to continue to allow child marriage, in today's day and age. But some of the really, kind of 16th century sexist arguments that I've heard against ending this human rights abuse, well, they come down to typically this notion that a pregnant teenage girl should be punished or shamed or has no choice but to marry even if she was raped.
But some groups, like Planned Parenthood, say lawmakers should focus on whether relationships are abusive rather than on marital status. So has there been any progress on changing the law? Well, there have been steps in the right direction in the last few years. Connecticut introduced a minimum marriage age of 16. New York raised the age threshold from 14 to 17. And Texas took steps to close some of the loopholes in its system. But Delaware is still the only state to have an outright ban on all marriage for all under 18s. So how does the US compare to the rest of the world? The rate of child marriage in America is actually much lower than in other countries. 3/4 of women in Niger are married before they turn 18. That's the highest rate of any country in the world. The Central African Republic, Chad, and Bangladesh are next on the list. Worldwide, 650 million women alive today were married as children. That's about 1 in 5 girls. And the US isn't the only country to have the controversial marry or rapist laws. 17 countries still allow men who have sex with an underage girl to avoid punishment by marrying their victim. Included in that list are Russia, Serbia, Thailand, and Greece. Despite its own problems, the US sponsors efforts to reduce child marriage around the world. Here's what President Obama had to say about child marriage in Kenya.
There's no place in civilized society for the early or forced marriage of children. These traditions may date back centuries. They have no place in the 21st century.
We in the United States, when we set our foreign policy, the U.S. State Department made very clear that marriage before 18 is a human rights abuse. And in establishing foreign policy, also identified ending child marriage abroad as a key strategy for empowering adolescent girls around the world. The federal government allocates more than $10 million a year to end child marriage abroad and to help child marriage survivors abroad. There's a stunning hypocrisy here.
So what about the UK? If you're 16 in England and Wales, you can get married with your parents' permission. And in Scotland, you don't even need that. So technically, the UK allows kids to marry. But there is a law that prevents children from being forced into marriage.